Hello, welcome to the Island Symphony Orchestra's Artists for Artists, a series of virtual master classes for serious amateur musicians and aspiring young musicians. My name is Eric Stewart. I'm the music director of the Island Symphony Orchestra, and we are doing a first today. We are presenting a composer performer, Jessica Meyer, who I first saw perform about a decade ago in New York City in her new music group Counter Induction, has recently become quite successful as a composer. So we'll be chatting with her about the music she writes, the instrument she plays, the viola, and how those things come together in different settings. And before we get to Jessica, I would like to thank the New York State Council on the Arts for the grant that makes this masterclass possible, and that grant is administered by the Huntington Arts Council. We are here with Jessica Meyer, violist composer. Welcome to our series.
Pleasure to be here.
Okay, so first I just wanted to ask about how you became interested in the viola. What made you decide that it was the viola that was for you?
This is a great question because I was at Gardner Manor School in Bayshore, and in the Bayshore school districts, when you are about to go into fourth grade, if you're interested in music, you're taken to the cafeteria and music teachers kind of test out your fingers and stuff like that. I to this day, I don't quite know what they were doing, about like looking at my hands maybe, but I said, I want to play violin just like everybody else. And then I got the news over the summer. It's like, well, we've run out of violins, but you're tall, so we're going to give you the viola. So it was actually not my choice at all. But I'm extremely thankful for whoever made that executive decision, because I think I can't think of a better instrument that I would like to serve and like advocate for, but also ones that we basically have the same vocal set. My range of my voice is like the range of the viola. So it's an instrument that I love dearly. So yes, that was completely made by somebody in the school office, that decision, but I stuck with it my entire life so far.
Oh wow, that's really interesting. You point out about your vocal range kind of mirroring the range of the viola. I don't know if it's a similar thing. I gravitate towards, I love the horn, and it's weird, I like to sometimes just sing things in falsetto, and I find that my falsetto, basically I can go up to the upper range of the horn and down to the lower range. So I wonder if that's a common thing for people to have that interest in vocally. And but anyway, I wanted to mention about the unique role that the viola plays, let's say in all sorts of music, but particularly orchestral music, since this is being viewed by members of the Island Symphony Orchestra who might be interested in kind of your perspective on how does the viola fit into the orchestral sound, the orchestral texture.
I just remember spending so many hours in the viola section, sort of being couched between the brass and the cellos. And to this day, still my favorite place to be. A lot of my orchestral work that I'm writing, I always give like the violas, cellos, and brass, like a lot of fun things to do.
Right.
And I think our role is, I'm like any violist, I'm thrilled whenever I see composers feel like they can take a risk and write interesting parts for the viola. Of course, I love the more later romantic repertoire when we had really fun things to play. And I'm the first record I remember hearing, really intently listening to the orchestra. My dad had all these records downstairs in a really big stereo, and I found some recording of Symphonie Fantastique. And I remember I must have been third grade or something, and I remember listening, and the beginning is so quiet and you don't know what's going on, but then later on you get the witches dance and everything, and I just remember just hearing like strings doing really fun things. And then so later on in orchestra, when I discovered that when the violists have a chance to actually participate in the really fun playing things as opposed to just keeping everybody together, that's what I deeply appreciate a composer. And so when I'm writing, also, I'm always making sure that the violist gets some cool melody, even if it's doubled by the horns or trombones or something, but, or that the cellists don't have all the fun and that the violist can jump in and, have a great time either with the melody or just like a really super fun passage.
Right.
So yeah, I think the more the viola evolved as an instrument, the better the orchestral parts became.
Okay.
And also I feel like in my early career, I spent so much time auditioning for orchestras. And I remember making the finals in Buffalo, which is a very small orchestra, but we went 5 rounds and, it was only one little missed note of Don Juan that knocked you out. I mean, like viola playing in general is of such a different level than, let's say, it was 100 years ago, 60 years ago, 40 years ago. So I think in the advent of that, people are equally considering the viola as a virtuosic instrument. And that's how I consider it also.
That's a cool thing.
I make it my lifelong passion to debunk any viola joke someone tries to throw my way. So
good for you. Good for you. And not only just the wonderful times when violas have the melody, but there are some just incredible inner voices. Sometimes you'll hear Brahms and Wagner and, to countless composers who just, the way it weaves through the texture is just so essential. And understanding, I guess, how to sometimes fit into that texture is a thing equally important to knowing when to, say, yay, here's the melody.
Yeah, and it can be a melody, but also I love how the viola, because since we're used to being in the middle of everybody all the time, that we're used to being the connectors. Whereas if you're used to only being the low end, or if you're used to only being violins or flutes, you don't necessarily get that perspective. So that's why, there are a lot of, great violists like Kenji Bunch and some other people who you can easily are also really effective composers, because we've just spent so much of our lives like in the middle of the orchestra and hearing everything in sort of like this, kind of wide perspective that we have.
That's interesting. Now that you mentioned that being a kind of I'm sure extremely helpful to you when you started composing. And I'm wondering what made you want to start composing, and when did that all start happening?
Well, it's funny because when I was a kid, I would always gravitate towards any free piano that was around and just sort of making stuff up on there. And that's how I would kind of occupy my time. And then when I started viola in Bayshore School District, and then when I got to high school, the theory class at Bayshore High School was essentially a composition class. And we had these cool computers, and we would have keyboards, and we can input different sounds, and it kind of sounded like something between, Enya and, Mannheim Steamroller, it's like, and I would spend hours in there. And so it's funny, like I had this sort of nascent viola composition career in high school. I won like the Long Island Composers Alliance. I wrote a piece for viola and me as like a little mini concerto. And Mr. Scalzo like toured me around like different conferences, but I never once thought of becoming a composer. I just thought, violist, I'm going to play an orchestra. That's my job. And so, and I'm actually, in retrospect, extremely thankful about that, because I had a very long, I'm still very much a violist, but just a good 18, 20 year career just playing viola in a lot of different styles and a lot of different situations. And when I kept like thinking, I'm not doing what I'm supposed to be doing, and this feels weird, like what am I supposed to be doing? And then that's when I picked up the looper and started messing around, and then realizing, oh my goodness, like the same way I would put sounds together as a child, or being in like Bayshore High School computer lab, like doing that. It was about, I mean, 10 years ago was my first looper piece. And so, and then once I got that feeling again, and that feeling of making something and really, really deeply enjoying that. And then I came out with the looper album. And then that same year in 2014, I wrote my first duo for somebody else. And then I heard them play it, and I'm like, oh, okay, this is it. This is what I'm supposed to be doing. And then everything just happened really fast after that, because I felt a definite purpose. And even though I didn't study composition or didn't go to school for it, I felt like I had 20 years of practical experience playing new music, because I was in a new music group that I think you've come to see our concerts.
Yeah.
And interpreting new music and being on the other side of the fence for so long, and also being in countless ensembles and orchestras, to just take what I come to know and translate that into my own language and what I had to say.
Wow.
So here we are.
Yeah. Wow. It's an amazing to see that all of those things that you experienced, kind of, they obviously informed how you approach it now. And I think that's fascinating to hear that through in your music, which we are going to listen to in a few moments. But since you mentioned it, just in case any of our current viewers are not aware, could you just briefly explain what a looper is?
Oh, sure. A loop pedal is something that guitarists use a lot, where if they want to lay down a rhythm and they sort of press this pedal and it starts recording whatever they're doing. And when they press it again, let's say that whatever they did was like 8 measures long, then the looper will just take those 8 measures and keep repeating them all over again. And so then they can play a solo on top or do some other things. But, different string players started using loopers. But when I got a hold of one, I don't know if you guys know Reggie Watts. He's this comedian who's really crazy and off the wall, but also he does these beatboxing concertos with looper, and he'll just sing into it and beatbox and like very virtuosically sing and do all these crazy things. And I saw him in Brooklyn, and it was just one of those moments where I'm like, that's it. I want to do that just with the viola. And then I went out and bought a looper, and I didn't even read the manual. I just started playing with it. And I think that's really important, and that with kids, especially now, is giving opportunities for them just to play and figure it out by themselves. And I think everything's so immediate now. So it's a little bit hard. I mean, I wouldn't be a composer hadn't I not spent so much time as a kid, like, oh my God, I'm lonely or I'm bored, so I'm going to go play the piano, or I'm going to go play with this thing, and also a huge credit to Bayshore school districts. If I didn't have such resources available to me to expand my creativity in a school setting, I mean, that's really kind of like my first studying composition was really then. And then there was just like a 15-year hiatus until I started messing around with it again. But yeah, super, super, super thankful. But that's kind of how it all started. And the looper was basically my training wheels to becoming a composer. Mm-hmm. Because you can only layer sounds in certain ways, and only certain kind of things work. And it gave me a certain set of enabling constraints. You could keep adding, and you could only take away the last thing that you added. So to actually compose a piece with like beginning, middle, and end, you had to kind of figure out, well, how can I do that with what I have? So when you listen to my piece, Source of Joy, you can see like you can have an intro, and then you can start building stuff, and then you can take it all away and then build something a little extra at the end. Or in some of my longer pieces that I've written for other people, it's just a lot of like taking different sections and erasing them and adding them back on. So when I finally got to write for other people and I didn't have to worry about that again, it was quite fun. you know.
That's great. Well, since you mentioned it, the piece Source of Joy for solo, viola, and looper, correct?
Yeah.
Why don't we listen to that right now? Okay, so we're back here with Jessica. And before we listen to the next piece of yours, the string trio, why don't you tell us a little bit about when you were an educator after you finished at Juilliard?
Sure. There was a big chunk of my life. I mean, I'm still an educator. I still love working with people to access their own creativity. But for many years, my main gig was to be a teaching artist for Lincoln Center, where they would send me out in all these different public schools to get kids ready to go see concerts. And part of that pedagogy was not that I would just show up as an artist and just lecture about, here's this concert you're going to see, and this is what you should know. It was more of a hands-on experiential workshop where, let's say, if these kids were about to go to Lincoln Center and see a string quartet play Beethoven, I would develop activities where they're doing similar processes as Beethoven is asking the string quartet to do. So, for instance, if there's a lot of motives being passed around, they would be in their own little quartets, whether with a violin, if they happen to be in a school that had a string program, but mostly it was like drums or little keyboards or something. It's like they start playing around with motives in groups of 4. And in order to express something, and they make a little piece with a beginning, middle, and end, then we would play them for each other, reflect on the choices they've made. And then, so when they would go see the group in Lincoln Center play Beethoven, they're hyper aware of all the different possibilities of the choices that could be made. And I also spent years like with the Hudson Valley Philharmonic, where there's this show with the orchestra every year. And I would go in the schools and get kids to write for the orchestra. And this is before I was a composer, but I was like facilitating so much creativity, like many, many, many hours a week. And it's funny because I remember being in the auditorium listening to the orchestra play something that I helped make. And I had this sort of like very weird out of body moment, like, this is important, but I didn't pay much attention to it. And I didn't realize till like so many years later, like, this is the work I'm supposed to be doing on a daily basis, is writing for orchestra and writing for other groups. But yeah, and I'm right now as an educator, I'm a super big fan of there's a lot of players like myself who didn't study composition who are kind of like asking permission for them to start. I'm like, you can start right now. It's like, if you have the idea, you're just making choices about sound and you're sequencing them in a particular way and you're doing it in a way that pleases you, because we don't have a particular, and then, contemporary classical music, there's not this prevailing style that you have to write in. It's not like the Baroque times or the classical times, or like where it's like, there's rules, we don't have those rules right now. There's a lot of people who are either very avant-garde or they're very, very tonal, or they're a mix of a bunch of different things like I am. And I think that whenever I'm teaching and sort of helping give permission for other people to start being creative, I then am fed and feel like it sort of widens my perspective. And the same as the player, like, I still perform a lot. I've written a concerto for myself that will be premiered hopefully within the next year. I love playing in ensembles that are premiering my works. I love showing up with my Baroque viola to like a gig in town, or playing with groups like Alarm Will Sound or other things around the country. So I think if I was just sitting here writing music all the time, I'd be very bored, or not as inspired. So I kind of have to access all these different parts of myself. And I think honestly, back in Bach and Mozart's, Beethoven's Liszt, I mean, everybody played, wrote, improvised. It's only been in the last century have we become very, compartmentalized in our specialty.
Yes.
So I'm kind of on the bandwagon of, if you have an instrument in your hand, you can make up your own music and you can make up your own choices about sound, and why not start today? So that's sort of where I'm at as an educator and a performer and as a composer. They all inform of each other, and keeps life interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, why don't we listen to another piece that you wrote? Why don't you introduce this string trio we're about to hear?
Oh, this piece is one of my favorite pieces. It's called I Only Speak of the Sun, and it's based on a Rumi ode. I only speak of the sun, and the sun is my master. And, tear off your mask, your face is glorious. And, it's a wonderful ode. If you go on my website, you can find it. But this is, I think, the first movement where I'm really using all of the sounds that I came to know about string playing. Because after many years in playing in my group Counterinduction and playing a lot of thorny European contemporary music, I kind of took those colors and all this way of playing like harmonics and all these cool bowing techniques that I come to know and try to put it in an ensemble piece. And I think by all my years of playing with looper, I'm used to these big textures. And I love making an ensemble sound way bigger than it is. So that's what's, I think, fun about this piece is the sheer amount of sound. And this was taped during COVID, so we were just so happy to be playing. So this is I Only Speak of the Sun.
We are back here with Jessica. And first of all, what a wonderful performance that was. That must have been so gratifying to be able to put that all together in the midst of, that was 2020, right? In the middle of all of the shutting down of everything, right?
Yeah. And I think what was interesting about that time is that we had a lot of different kinds of opportunities available to us. And the Trinity Lutheran on 65th Street created a whole series of really well done services where they not only lit it, but had amazing musicians come in and do all sorts of different things. And so I was very fortunate that they asked me to have to actually just have a service where my music was interspersed within it, and I was thrilled. And they were lighting there was a lot of alcohol being thrown on this big cauldron of fire while we were filming, which was hilarious. But it was all new situations bring new experiences, so I was very thankful about that.
Wow. Well, this is everybody's opportunity who is watching along to ask any questions you have of Jessica about the music she composes, or about playing the viola, or about anything that comes to mind. And I'll get the ball rolling by saying your use of, I hear lots of natural harmonics, and you like to use them to create textures, and is how do you kind of envision that in your writing? Because I mean, they are the string instruments, they lend themselves so naturally to those types of sounds. Wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. I mean, so much of playing the viola is we're so used to having such deep sounds that we get to play, and if we're going to play up really high, that means we're up in a register that's really hard to get to sometimes. But when you just put your finger down, you take this and just don't put it down all the way, and then have this much higher pitch that I didn't have to struggle to get. So, I can do that, or And I just love the immediacy of getting really high notes without trying too hard. So, and then when you have a bunch of string players doing it, you can have sort of a thicket of lots of different sounds creating a texture that normally wouldn't be possible with real fingers being all the way down. So I find that after all of my years of playing new music, I love exploring all the different textures I learned, like sul ponticello and like, throwing the bow, and, doing fun gestures, or even later on in the string trio, like overpressure. So like getting a really gnarly sound to express something really, a different kind of pathos. It's something different. So yeah, so I think that all my years playing other people's music and developing a vocabulary of sound specific to strings made it easier for me to jump over as a composer and also just celebrate what I love about string instruments. So yeah,
that's great. And you talked about taking, I guess, things you may have picked up when you were playing lots of different contemporary music and then applying it to music in your own way. I'm curious, are there any composers that you've used their techniques that you, let's say you love the way they use them in particular pieces? Are there any composers you kind of gravitated towards, let's say for extended techniques and how you incorporated it into your music?
Yeah, I mean, Salvatore Sciarrino is almost all of his string pieces are all harmonics. And that's like a real intense, example of somebody who just loves fragile sounds. And very rarely does any of his music go above mezzo forte. And so you have this sort of squirreless, like little sound world where it's just like all these like tweets and things like that. And like, I'm like, going to an earlier composer like Messiaen, I love just his use of melody, but then he'll get these wonderful kinds of sounds and textures by how he uses color. And whereas like if you think of another kind of European composer like Xenakis and how you just like use these really throaty, like really crazy, like really crazy kind of again, more textures to create. But I like taking those ideas and then using it in a way, in a more tonal, expressive way, in order to express the emotions that I like to write with.
Right, and I really liked how you said, as composers, we're really just sequencing sounds together. We're taking sounds that we like and we're sequencing them together. And I think that the idea of using different textures and things like this and finding how, when let's say earlier composers may have thought harmonically, how does this progression lead to this progression? But they were also thinking about textures and how do textures come together. And sometimes when you just isolate the textures and let the textures kind of speak and move the music forward, you can create sound, you can find sound worlds that you haven't heard before. And I think that's what I loved about listening to your music. It's a journey, in a different way, still in a tonal kind of framework. You could call it tonal, but the way you propel the music is different than, let's say, a lot of other tonal composers. And I think that's really wonderful.
I don't know if it's one of the reasons, but I don't think of harmony when I write. I don't plan chord progressions. I just sort of live in a land of what the tension between consonant intervals and dissonant intervals. So I kind of think of harmony this way instead of this way. But yet, I think, and also I think modally often, like, okay, here I'm in like B flat, E flat land, and I tend to think of it. And honestly, that's sort of like something that grew out of me writing for looper, because when you're writing a looper piece, you can't actually enter chord progressions unless you spend like the minute for the first loop being a whole chord progression of what you want the piece to be, and then you go back and add on top of it. It would take forever. Right. So I kind of found myself thinking, okay, how can I create harmonic structures and counterpoint and a sense of flow with the enabling constraint that I can't actually set up chord progressions on this looper easily. So I found that that sort of like kind of snuck into all my music. But it's, you know, it's fun sometimes that my focus is, I don't know what the harmony is going to be, but I know that there's a shape, and like we're going to get big here and we're coming back from this here, and what kind of colors and textures can I make use of the instruments in order to create that shape.
Right. The structure, I think, of the pieces is very clear and immediate because of that. When you hear it, it's very much, you can almost say, like a narrative that's happening. Now, here's something that might be interesting. You talked about you like to encourage people to be creative and get them to, with the instrument or anything. For string players, are there any sounds that you discover that, let's say, are very interesting to you and sound really cool and maybe sound really complicated but aren't too difficult? Let's say if a violinist listening right now has their instrument and you say, hey, try this out, this might give you some ideas.
Oh, I love, writing for string instruments in a way like Baroque composers did, where you have open strings, and you could use open strings in a way that you could play really fast without going crazy over here because you have open strings. And if you write intelligently, and same thing with all the double stops that you could possibly do, and like you could, while you're playing an open string, you could shift to someplace quickly. So yeah, it's funny because in orchestra playing, we're taught like never use open strings because we all have to be in tune in exactly the same way and you're always covered up. But then when I started playing on my Baroque field, a lot more ensemble engagements, Baroque composers knew like open strings are what help create the whole resonance of the instrument. And so once I started, I started writing for myself in looper around the same time I played a lot of Baroque music. And so a lot of those ways of creating texture and tapping into an instrument's resonance definitely informed a lot of my writing, because I love making instruments sound like, way bigger than they are, and figuring out ways of doing that.
Okay,
I'd say, the open string banjo method is definitely something to make something sound harder than it is.
Okay, and I have a question as that composers might be interested in knowing. As far as harmonics go, are there certain harmonics that you find sound really good and you use a lot more, and there are other harmonics that might be kind of don't speak quite as well and you don't use them as much? Just generally, as for strings, are there certain ones that are kind of, how would you map that out for a composer who wants to incorporate harmonics into their music?
Sure. Well, I would say like natural harmonics, not so there's two kinds of harmonics. Natural harmonics was when you just put the finger down lightly and then it creates immediately. And I feel like those ring a lot more because you're using open strings to enhance the resonance of your instrument. The other way to create a harmonics is if you put a finger down and then you just put your fourth finger down, a fourth above it, but don't press all the way down. Then you're going to get a touch 4, or like it immediately pops up 2 octaves. And then you can shift. And those can always be controlled. That's a hard thing I learned. Like I wrote a whole movement once for string trio and piano and clarinet. And I was inspired by the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, and I wanted all these light sounds. But the problem, I had all these, natural harmonics, and then I realized after the fact, I'm like, well, you can't tune them because if your strings are out of tune, they're just out of tune. So it kind of added to the specialty of the piece. But I sort of then realized the hard way that if you have everybody doing natural harmonics, you're naturally going to have like a pitchiness to it because you can't tune them. Mm-hmm. So I feel like my advice as a composer is that, if someone's doing a natural harmonic riff, or like and I only speak of the sun, all of that was all natural harmonics for the most part. Just know that you're getting a really resonant effect, but it's not going to be like exactly in tune, you know. So if you're going, so but yeah, I feel like you really need harmonics in lower positions are better. They just ring more. And also, huge fan of like a harpist can pluck a harmonic. You know, we can do it too, and it sounds pretty cool. But it has to be just the octave above the string. Anything lower, natural harmonics, they don't go.
Okay.
But yeah, those are my favorite. Yeah.
Okay, well, I just learned something. I had never heard plucked natural harmonics on the octave before, so that does sound really, like you said, like harp-like almost.
Yeah,
really lovely.
And on cello too, sounds really cool. It just like reverberates forever.
Okay, wow. Well, I've learned something. I hope all of our viewers have learned something. I think we've gone over a lot of different ideas, and like I said, you're the first composer we've had on our series, so this has been really a lot of fun. And thank you for coming and showing us all these things and doing show and tell with your instrument. And I think I speak for our orchestra membership that it was a pleasure, and we hope to hear some of your music being performed when, I'm sure, you know, we'll all look you up and see when the next performance is. Do you have anything coming up you can tell us about?
Yeah, in the spring, I have about 6 premieres in 6 weeks, so it's a lot going on. I'm writing right now for the President's Own Marine Band, and that will be in March. And the Bangor Symphony Orchestra also in March. But yeah, I will update my website. But between February and March, there's a whole bunch of things, you know, the kind of backlog that a lot of composers have been experiencing, where a piece was supposed to be premiered and it keeps getting postponed. So now spring will be busy. So you want to check back at the beginning of the year. And also now a lot of organizations are making it policy that they're also doing live streams. So that reaches a lot more people than just the folks in the hall. So perhaps you can catch some of those. Yes,
please do. Everybody, please check these out. And you said February and March, there will be a lot going on?
Yeah, from the beginning of mid-February all the way through March.
Okay, great. Well, I can use that as this moment to thank everybody for tuning in. And if you want to catch the Island Symphony to warm yourself up for all of the new premieres of Jessica's, you can catch our Bach Festival on January 30th and then tune into Jessica's stuff in February and March. And that will make for hopefully a happy new year for everybody. So thank you all for tuning in. Thanks again, Jessica, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure.